So last time we were asking the question, what kind of truth does psychoanalysis offer? And pretty much immediately we started struggling with the question of how psychoanalysis, the act itself, becomes shrouded in myths and narratives that mystify it. And this is unavoidable. We have to hear about psychoanalysis from somewhere. It is gonna arrive in some form or another. And today, in today's media, when we're dealing with memes about Freud's cocaine habits and fucking your mom, we're gonna have to be dealing with the question of what kinds of mystifications we have created about psychoanalysis in order to account for them. You see, often we find that one of the most common images of psychoanalysis, or what the psychoanalyst does, concerns the figure of the couch, where the psychoanalyst lays you down and where you get to tell the listening psychoanalyst all your troubles. Now, the question is, what shall we make of this image of psychoanalysis? Does it in any way inform us of the practice and theory of psychoanalysis? And while cartoony, the image does hold some trace of a faithful representation of psychoanalysis, at least to the extent that it can be a starting point for us to expound psychoanalysis through it. So let's go back to the couch, lay down. This image of the couch of the analyst concerns itself with a question that can be framed in two sentences. I'm speaking myself out, or I'm spoken out. The central point of concern here is the analysand, insofar as they are trying to self-narrate. Why self-narration? Self-narration is a starting point for us as insofar as we can begin to build spaces, things that may break the concepts that we have to use every day. Because one of the things that psychoanalysis invites us to do is to slowly play onwards, slowly break down the fixed formalities of how we try to go about speaking in everyday life. When we allow ourselves to self-narrate, we can build obscure meanings on words that may only be known between my analyst and me. I don't necessarily need to be engaging with a form of speaking that is necessarily public to anyone, except that it is in some regard, and we'll see how. So in this case, we're building what Lacan at some point in his work talks about topologies as structures, as spaces. When we're self-narrating, we're navigating certain forms of spaces, and these are the kinds of spaces that psychoanalysis has built for its practice. In this case, we're going to be looking at self-narrative, metaphor, metonymy, and the imaginary. So, again, self-narration is important because of a more general theme to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis challenges the supposition that we are transparent to ourselves, something akin to a Cartesian subject, the famous I think therefore I am, or the Husserlian transcendental ego, as this eye that just watches from afar and just captivates every passing vignette of the phenomena of everyday life, of the natural position we take on to the world. So psychoanalysis differs from these positions, especially in what we call the tradition of decentering the subject. In the tradition of decentering the subject, psychoanalysis presupposes that consciousness is always already outside itself, that there's a gap that splits it, that we are not just actually transparent to ourselves. It is in this sense that the analysand is self-narrating, with the impression that they know what they are talking about to the analyst, even though they may give away much more than they intended to say. Thus, when I say the phrase, I'm speaking myself out, this should be taken as the attitude that presumes an alleged sense of transparency to oneself, as apprehended through representations of ourselves. I see myself as thinking that I am. I see myself as a plaything to my thinking. So I'm telling you what I think I am. In other words, I'm spoken out. And this can be taken in the sense of being found out. that the analysand may give too much away, or that there is something where nothing should be according to the pretension of transparency in self-narrative. In short, well, I didn't see that one coming, I suppose. So far, we can say of self-narrative in the analysand's speech in this following statement. Self-narrative concerns the representation of myself, the ego or myself as a me object apprehended. It is a question of self-image insofar as it concerns active recollection, that I'm actively calling out memories to come back to me. In these, I find bits and pieces of myself as I'm trying to recall being myself. And thus, the self, as it concerns memory work and language, it operates as a mnemonic device. Self-narrative also comes out with the supposition that it is complete, or that full communication can be achieved insofar as language is a closed system of constructible memory knowledge, as communication is always already enveloped in a sense of unity that pretends to have no gaps and contradictions. So we can think this of an example of a man that is doing all this man work, constantly acting as like, I cannot help but be a man. So I cannot but act like a man. The boys will be boys attitude. When one is trying to recall oneself, one is trying to patch every gap of inconsistency in order to reassure oneself of the narrative at hand. It seems then that the function of the censor in self-narrative amounts to the rejection or suppression of what fails to coincide with our ego, self-narrative, or self-image, sometimes manifested as a breakdown of communication and its functions, or a disruption of the linguistic mnemonic devices where recollection becomes difficult, where I'm struggling to even say what I'm trying to recall back, that I'm only hovering around it. Self-narrative sustains its sense of unity by predicating any form of whatever is other than ego, whatever is other than myself, this otherness, to something that is outside myself, to something that is outside this self-sameness, while sustaining this otherness to the ego. I am a man, and that is not what a man would do. It did it, not me, because I am a man. In that sense, self-narrative is trying to hide that it is in self-narrative, that its function may come into twists and knots, that what it lacks in its ontological incompleteness, in this lackness of that is central to its being, is brought to our attention, that it may end up being spoken out rather than speaking myself out.